on a live basis. So one of the things that to always keep in mind is the majority of what we're going to market on the East Coast through those markets are going into what we would consider non-traditional type markets, and rely heavily upon our ethnic markets, as well as and so with that, those revolve quite a bit around certain holidays, times of year, and that sort of thing that can affect prices, as well as the class and quality of those animals from that standpoint. And if you look at some of our recent market reports, you can easily see that quality will have an impact on price, and quite a bit of variation, as we can see quite a bit of spread within different weight categories of our sheep and goats and those small ruminants, in terms of where they're at. Just for instance, if you just look at this past week, at some of the sales, those middleweight kind of prime marketing weights, 50 to 70 into the light 80s, can see spreads in some of those categories from what we would call those either low end number 2 type goats, or our good quality low choice type lambs, up into those choice primes. On the lamb side of things, you can see spreads, almost as much as $1 a pound spread within those categories. So right now, we're kind of seeing on the sheep side of things, anywhere from on the low end, probably around 210, up to as high as in some of the 50, 60 pounders, north of $3 a pound, right on some of the recent sales. And our kid goats would be even higher than that in those respected weights right now. So started to see those prices starting to kind of increase, as we would expect going into this time of year, especially when we start looking at where some of the holidays within the Islamic community is going to land this year, with the end of Ramadan coinciding shortly after Easter, setting things up for March and April to be fairly strong marketing months from that standpoint on the live basis. So if get those lambs, it may definitely pay to be looking at marketing those in those prime weight ranges of 60 to 80 pounds, not necessarily holding them to be much heavier than that, especially when we start penciling if you have to tote some commercial feed to them. So with that, I know Lee and I are kind of sharing some of this early on here, so I'll kind of wrap up with kind of where those markets are right now. Like I said, look to March and April, and even May and June probably are going to stay fairly strong for us when we start looking at some of the other holidays that may come into play there in the middle to the latter part of June. So Lee, on the direct marketing and meat side, I'll flip it over to you, and I guess if we've got questions on our side, we can maybe address them afterwards.
Yeah, well, while Lee's getting his screen set up, I apologize. I'm a bad host, but we got some poll questions here to get the evening started off, and I'm going to go ahead and launch those. And while y'all were working on that, if you don't mind, put in the chat where you're from, so we'd like to know where all the audience that we're reaching out to. So if you wouldn't mind just putting in where you're from. If you're in North Carolina, put in what city you're from. But there's the polls, and we'll get those started while Lee gets his screen shared up, because he's got a few slides to share.
Can y'all see that? That share come through.
Yeah, good. Looks good to me.
All right. I was talking in the background for a second while everybody's answering poll questions. But yeah, my name's Lee Menas. I work with the NC Choices program at NC State University Extension. And we primarily work with farmers and processors and others along the local meat supply chain. So, that's our area. And so I'll just kind of hit you up with a few of the opportunities that are out there now for anybody that's looking to do direct to consumer marketing and marketing meat. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to go through the polls. I'll just start bouncing through a few pictures.
I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here.
All right. Yeah. So for those of y'all that are interested in it, and I had to poll results to see if anybody's doing it now, but there are some opportunities out there for selling meat, getting your lambs butchered and then taking that meat and then going to market it through different avenues. And a few of those avenues might be farm stores. A lot of farms start out with farmers markets, as an option rather than investing in more of a brick and mortar type place on your farm. But online stores, since COVID came around, if there's been a bright spot to COVID, it's made a few things better, even though it made a few things worse. But online stores have definitely gotten much easier in the last 3 years, and that software has gotten a lot better. And so there's a lot of good sales platforms out there that if you take a little bit of time, or you got kids or grandkids, you can turn loose on it that are maybe a little more tech savvy. Those are fairly easy to create. And then we also got what we traditionally have called our freezer sales, freezer beef, freezer pork, freezer lamb. And that's generally thought of selling animals in bulk. So you contract with a customer to buy a whole or a half, generally in the sense of lambs, it's a whole lambs, just because of the amount of meat. But there are a few different things you can do there. And those have really seemed to have taken off with COVID, especially as our consumers out there have gotten more interested in buying meat direct from farmers down the road and getting to know exactly who that connection is. Now, some of the challenges with that are it does have to be processed. If we're talking about selling meat instead of live animals, you do have to go through an inspection process, which is outlined by the law. And, there's some added expense because not only, Neil was talking about taking to some of the graded sales and stuff and some of these other markets where you deliver a live animal and then you get paid on that live animal weight. What we're talking about here is taking that value of that lamb that you could be doing something else with. If it's just say $500 for a lamb, you're going to add a processing cost and dealing with the processor. So, that could be another $100, $150 worth of processing cost. And then if you take a 75, 80 pound lamb to the processor, what you're going to end up getting back is going to be about 40 pounds of meat. So, you're dealing with less poundage product. And so thinking about, takes a little planning and a little thought to put into it and develop a good pricing scheme that can do it. And that, straight up, that can kind of be a challenge these days with lamb prices having been as good as they are. But the opportunities are still out there. And so keep those in mind. And, this is something that if you're interested in pursuing, we are doing some workshops. We've got one coming up April 4th at NCA&T where we're going to be talking about some direct marketing to consumers and kind of how to build that business. Like I said before, when you're dealing with meat instead of live animals, there are a few rules. All red meat, if it's going to enter commerce and be sold as meat, has to go through the inspection process. What does that mean? That means that it goes through a plant that is in the either USDA or NCDA inspection, has a grant of inspection for one of those two entities. And every single animal that's slaughtered is going to get looked at by an inspector to make sure it's healthy and wholesome and fit to enter the food, be sold as food. And so every single carcass that comes out of that plant or every package that is processed under that inspection is going to have a mark on it. And, just the quick and dirty on the inspection process, if it's got a round mark, so it's USDA or U.S. Department of Agriculture, this is a USDA grant of inspection. This is a circular seal that would be on all those packages. NCDA does run a state inspection program, and North Carolina is one of about 20 some states that offers that. And our NCDA inspection is this pentagram. And so, or parallel, whatever kind of gram that thing is, little square with the slanted sides. So it's the big difference here is depending on what you want to do, where you want to sell, is if your product has a USDA inspection on it, you can take it out across state lines. You could go to Virginia to a farmer's market, you go to South Carolina, you can put it in a cooler and drive it to California and set up at a farmer's market, and you'd be perfectly fine because that inspection carries anywhere throughout the states. If you are dealing with a plant that offers NCDA inspection, then this one is this on the package means that product must be sold within the boundaries of North Carolina. And so just be aware of that if that's something you want to pursue. The other thing you'll have to have is a meat handler's license. This is a program that is administered by NCDA, Meat and Poultry Inspection Division. And so if you're going to have this is required if you're handling that packaged meat post-processing. So get an animal processed, you go and you pay the processor, you pick it up and you take that product to a farmer's market, or you take it home to store until you go to a farmer's market, or you deliver it to your customer. If you're handling it post-processing, you got to have a meat handler's license. Pretty simple process. Call Meat and Poultry Inspection Office at NCDA, and they will give you the guidelines. But the gist of it is they're going to come out and visit you. They're going to see that you got proper transport, coolers or freezer to haul that back and forth between the processor and to your end markets. If it's farmer's market or delivering to restaurants or whatnot, you got to have dedicated storage. So you got to have something, it can be a simple chest freezer. They want to see that it's just in a safe and secure location, and it's it's in a clean location, doesn't have rats and cats climbing all over it, and back in the back corner of the lamb barn. They're also going to check that everything in that freezer has a mark of inspection on it. Here you can see some packages of ground beef, and you can see that round mark of inspection. That freezer is going to be required to contain only your inspected meats. So no deer burger from last hunting season, no chicken pot pies that grandma sent you after Christmas. It's just got to be inspected product. And they're going to come back about once a year and pop in and check on you and make sure everything's going well and that you're living up to your end of the deal. It's a good way this is their means for kind of tracking and keeping an eye on, knowing who's out there dealing in local meats. That way they can, if there's an issue at a plant, they kind of have a way of tracing back and letting people know, getting the word out to consumers. They can go back to their meat handlers and kind of figure out where the problems may have extended to. This is also a good, important part, because for programs like ours, this is how we kind of gauge what's happening in the local meat world and in that industry. And that's one of the things is back pre-COVID, I think we were at about 1,200 meat handlers, licensed meat handlers, and like late 2019, early 2020. Since then, I think we're crowding 2,000 registered meat handlers that are farmers. So you can see there's been a significant increase in our meat handlers in the last 3 years. And to give you an idea, 20 years ago when I got mine, I think I was number 300 or something in 2003 or 2004. So yes, grown pretty quick. If this is something you're interested in, there's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me through Adam or Dr. Weaver also, but ncchoices.com is our website. We've got a lot of resources on there pertaining to local meats and marketing and processing and just all sorts of stuff. So get a chance to go check it out. Reach out if you got questions. And with that, I'll bounce it back over to whoever's in charge.
Does anybody have any questions for Neil or Lee? We got one in the chat. She says, I know this about small ruminants, but you have to have a meat handler's license for rabbits and chickens.
So meat handler's license is only for inspected product. So if you're killing rabbits on your own farm, which that's overseen by NCDA's Food and Drug Division. So that's kind of separate from the meat and poultry. And there are provisions that you can get set up to kill them. And there's also provisions in North Carolina for a poultry exemption, allowing you to kill up to 20,000 birds a year. The animals that are processed under those circumstances, under those exemptions on farm, will not have a mark of inspection and therefore are not required to have a meat handler's license, simply because as a requirement of participating in either one of those, you're already having to sign up and go through that process. So they have you on the radar there. The meat handler's license is only for inspected product post-processing. Yeah, real quickly on the exemptions, I won't hit it very much, but yeah, there's federal law allows for an exemption that you can slaughter up to 20,000 birds of your own raising on your farm. Can't do it for other people. They can't be other people's birds, but you can do that, and you can market those birds, farmers markets, restaurants, retail, farm stores, whatever. And there's some requirements to go with that. Those are outlined on NCDA's meat and poultry inspection website. They've got that list of requirements, as well as the notice that with the label. There's label requirements, and similar to the meat handlers, they're going to come check you. Rabbits, it's actually a similar type process, but you have to meet certain guidelines and get set up with a processing place on your farm. Neither one of them are overly complicated, and if that's something you're interested in, reach out to us or reach out to your local livestock agent, and they can help you navigate that.
Well, thanks, Neil, and thanks, Lee, for helping out participating in this presenting tonight. We'll switch gears a little bit and let Dr. Andrew Weaver, he's going to present this evening. Dr. Weaver is a professor at NC State, as well as our NC State Extension small ruminant specialist. And he's going to do some talks on some basic genetic improvements that we can make in our flocks and herds.
Can you see that all right?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Look okay?
Yep, looks good. Perfect.
Sounds good. Well, welcome everybody. So we'll kind of switch gears here and talk about genetics, but want to keep in mind that the marketing information that you just heard about is paramount, and that's going to really drive the genetic and the selection decisions that you make for your flock or your herd. So with all that in mind, I think one of the kind of central points we need to remember is that after 4 generations, over 90% of the genetics in your flock or your herd are the results of sire decisions. So, this is assuming you're keeping back replacement females. You're not buying in female animals. But after 4 generations, which in sheep and goats is not that long of a time period, just several years, potentially, the vast majority of the genetics that exist on your farm could be the result of, maybe just a handful of ram purchases or buck purchases that you made. So it's very important, and our number one job then would be to find the right ram or buck. And a quote that I heard that I think is very fitting is, the best ram is really the right ram for the situation. The right ram for you could very likely be different than the right ram for me. Based on our production systems, based on our markets, we could need 2 very different sheep, and those sheep, could be extremely valuable to each one of us, but could be very different. And so we need to remember that it's not just the barn favorite, it's not the lot one in a given sale that we all need to buy. It's really about finding that right animal, that animal that's going to work and it's going to meet the needs of your operation, your flock, or your herd at that given time. So keep that in mind as well. We need to remember that change is inevitable, but progress is optional. And so, whether we apply selection pressure, whether we utilize the genetic tools that we have or not, things are going to change. Some traits might get better, some traits might get worse. But if we don't take any measurable action on that, we don't really know if they're going to get better or worse. We know they're going to change. So if we actually want to make progress in a direction that we want to go, if we want our weaning weights to get heavier, if we want our animals to have more lambs or kids born, if we want to make progress in parasite resistance, then we need to actually take action towards making that happen. And to do that, we need selection. We need to actually apply selection pressure. We need to have a goal to progress towards. If we don't know where we're going, then how do we know where to apply that selection pressure and what direction we need to go in? So identifying goals, and the first question you should probably ask yourself is, what kind of producer do you want to be? Kind of what's your goal? What role in the industry do you want to play? And we can all play different roles, and there's nothing wrong with any of those given places within the industry. We just need to determine where we want to be. And I like to use this industry pyramid over here on the right. We think about, we have elite, we have seed stock breeders, those purebred producers, at the very top of the pyramid that have really good genetics. They pass those genetics on to commercial producers who have generally larger herds or flocks, and they're producing animals that are going to, slaughter lambs, market kids that are going to go to those packers. The packers obviously sell that product to retailers, distributors, which eventually ends up at the consumer base. And so, kind of where do we want to fall? Do we want to be a very well-known, commercial producer, raising lots of lambs and kids to sell into maybe some of those markets that Neil talked about? Do we want to be have some purebred livestock and produce high quality breeding stock to sell and market to other producers? Just determine where you want to be. And really that comes back to, what is your market? And depending where you are in this pyramid, that's going to determine some of what your market is. What is your market reward? What is your market discount? What is your market? That's one of the first questions we as livestock producers ought to be asking ourselves. If we don't know where that product is going at the end of the day, then how do we know how to do anything else? How do we know what genetics to use? How do we know what nutrition program to use? All of those things are going to depend on the market. If you're selling 60 to 80 pound slaughter lambs into some of the markets that Neil talked about, that may require very different sheep, a very different type of production system than if you're selling, larger lambs, retail cuts into some of these direct marketing opportunities. If you're selling, racks of lamb at the local farmers market, you may need a very different sheep, a heavier sheep, a larger sheep, than if you're selling some of these really lightweight, non-traditional type sheep. So keep that in mind. And again, there's pros and cons to each opportunity, but we just need to determine where we want to be and what role we want to play, and then base our decisions off of that. And then that comes down to, what are the economically relevant traits to your operation? So based on your market and what your market's going to reward or discount, what traits are relevant to you? What traits can you actually apply dollars and cents to? If your market's going to pay you more for a heavier muscled animal, well, then I'm going to select for heavier muscled animals because muscle would be an economically relevant trait. If the market's going to pay you for having a lot more lambs or kids available to market, then I'm going to select for more prolific females that are going to have more lambs or kids born and reared so that I can market those individuals. So keep in mind what those economically relevant traits are to your operation, and every operation may have slightly different economically relevant traits. And then you need to assess your current production status. So what are your current flocks, strengths, and weaknesses? Kind of what's the status as of today? Some things your flock or herd may already do very well, but then there may be some things that need improving. It requires observation and records to do this, and we need to remember that if we don't write it down, it didn't happen. So we need to actually take those records, record those things, so we have that benchmark and we know where we sit today, so that we know, okay, I'm doing pretty well in these traits, but maybe I can use some improvements in these traits over here. And Andy's gonna, in the next section, gonna talk about some of these records that we can collect, how to collect the records and how to utilize them. And so I'll leave that for his talk. When we think about the principles of genetic improvement, I really like this quote. If you don't measure it, you can't improve it. if we don't take those measurements, how can we improve on anything we're doing? Because we don't know where we're at today. And so we need to take the measurements, record those measurements, and that's going to provide us with a benchmark, an assessment of how we're doing. And then based on our current level of production, our current status, and then what those goals are, we can establish selection priorities. So, if our sheep, maybe they grow really fast and we're doing really well there, but we need more parasite resistance. Maybe one of our goals is to improve parasite resistance within our flock. Well, if current levels of parasite resistance are not acceptable, then we can apply selection pressure. We can determine that one of our selection priorities needs to be parasite resistance, and we can focus in on that as an area to make improvement. So these are just some examples of economically relevant traits. Like I said, they're going to vary some operation to operation, but a lot of these are relevant across many flocks, many herds. And so, fertility, prolificacy is a big one. Obviously, those females that we have, we want them to get pregnant. We want them to have lots of babies. We need them to milk all right. And we want frame size and moderate, mature size. And we want to keep that in check so that we don't have these gigantic females that suck up all of our feed resources, especially in times like we have now where, feed costs are not cheap, and we need to manage how much we're putting into those animals. Growth, depending on what your market is, if I'm selling 135-pound lambs, growth potential is going to need to be very different than if I'm selling 60-pound lambs. And that kind of goes along with the composition as well. How much yield are you actually going to get out of those carcasses? What's some of those quality attributes, especially if you're dealing with some of those direct markets, some of those quality attributes may come into play even more so when we think about, producing high quality retail cuts to market. Feed efficiency, I put a question mark here because, again, I think it's a trait that's pretty important and certainly economically relevant, but we don't know a whole lot about it at this point. We're starting to do some research in this area, but we don't know a lot, and we don't have necessarily the tools for feed efficiency like we have for some of these other traits. But maybe with time, those things will come around and be available. But we need to keep that in mind. Which animals can sustain themselves on less inputs and keep themselves going, maintain body condition, raise heavy litters of lambs or kids. Those animals that are more efficient, certainly beneficial with high input costs that we currently have. So we need to remember the difference between phenotype and genotype. So we think about our selection programs. We think about, how do we have these animals? How do I actually make improvement in these traits that I just talked about? And so genotype, that's the animal's genetic makeup. And the environment is the environment that they're exposed to, the environment that they live in, what they get fed, the barn they're housed in, how much, additional assistance we provide to improve their livelihood. And so what we observe, when we say phenotype, that's any observable traits. So a phenotype could be, how that animal looks. It could also be that, the weaning weight that we collect. Any of those phenotypes, any of those observable traits are the combination of genetic factors as well as the environment that we expose that animal to. So it takes both, and both influence it. And actually, the vast majority of what we observe in phenotype is actually controlled by the environment. And so if we're not careful, and if we just select based on phenotype alone, we are inadvertently selecting for environment, and the environment on your farm is very different, or could be very different than the environment on my farm. And environment's not even the same on one given farm. The environment may not be the same this year as it is next year. And so if we're only selecting on phenotype, we may run into some problems in that we could be selecting animals that maybe performed really well in this environment, but maybe might not perform so well in another environment. So we need to be able to figure out what's genetic, what's the genotype, because genotype, an animal's DNA, is going to stay the same, whether it's on your farm, on my farm. The genotype stays the same generation, or can be passed on, I should say, from generation to generation. And so if we can select on genotype, we can make measurable improvements in a much more controlled way. So we've got a lot of selection tools or selection philosophies, you might say, about how do we make progress? And so I've kind of summarized these. in 5 different tools or methodologies that we might have. It's a beauty pageant. We can use performance records, which Andy's going to highlight even more so here in a little bit. Adjusted performance records. We've got RAM or buck test evaluation and what we call estimated breeding values. So just to quickly highlight all of these things, when I'm referring to it, it's a beauty pageant. I'm referring to, the structural attributes, what we observe and how that animal looks. And the pros of this is, we all like to have animals that we enjoy looking at. We have to go out and feed them every day. We have to look at them out in our pastures and our barns. It's certainly nice to have some animals that are good to look at. And I won't deny that. It is certainly nice to have that. But we need to remember that this is a phenotypic form of selection. How that animal appears is going to be, some of that's going to be genetic, but a lot of that's also going to be the environment. Feed can have a huge impact on how that animal appears. So the cons are, it's more of a phenotypic measurement than a genotypic measurement. Are the traits economically relevant? If people are buying your animals based on how they look, then maybe it's an economically relevant trait. If they're not, then it might not be an economically relevant trait. And is there consensus between breeders about, what is ideal? The characteristics of an animal that you really like may not necessarily be what someone else also likes. And so having some consistency between breeders may be beneficial here. We need to be cognizant of that and just using, how that animal looks as a sole selection tool. So there may be some value here, there may not be some value here. We need to keep that in mind. The use of performance records, and I've already mentioned, the value of records and setting that benchmark. It provides us with an assessment of current production, and we know, based on that, where we may need areas of improvement. We market animals off of these traits. What that animal weighs when they go to market is we're going to be paid. The price that we're paid is oftentimes based on how much they weigh. And so by measuring these traits, oftentimes we can measure, what the market is actually going to reward us for. But again, this is a phenotypic form of selection. The performance records, how much they weigh at weaning, some of that's going to be genetic, but some of that's, just how much we fed them. If we feed them more, they're going to weigh more, regardless of what their genetics are. So we need to keep that in mind. There's a lot of other environmental factors that influence these metrics that we know about, dam age, the age of the lamb or the kid, the litter size, other management factors. We know that, really young ewes or really old ewes are going to wean lighter lambs than ewes that are 3, 4, 5 years old. We know that if we wean a lamb at 90 days of age, they're going to weigh more than if we wean them at 60 days of age. And we know that, litter size certainly has an impact as well. And that brings us to these adjusted performance records, where a lot of these known environmental influences, we can adjust for them. We know the impact that they have, and so we can apply adjustment factors. And I have just a few examples, and we're not going to spend too much time tonight going over how to calculate these adjusted performance records, but we can use these records and we can adjust for these areas of known environmental influence. And so we know that, the doe kids are going to weigh less than the buck kids. So if we want to put them on the same playing field, we've got to adjust those doe kids up. We know that an animal that's born as a triplet and reared as a triplet is going to be lighter than one born and reared as a single. So we can adjust those triplets so that they're comparable to our animals that are born as singles. So we can try to put everyone on the same playing field so that we're able to compare between those individuals and not unfairly discount one just because maybe they were born to a young animal or a young mother or, born and reared as a multiple. But again, this is a phenotypic form of selection. We haven't isolated out what's genetic versus what's environmental. So it's still phenotypic, and we don't sell livestock on adjusted weights. Unfortunately, when they go to the sale barn, they weigh what they weigh when they get there, and the sale barn doesn't care if they were a single or a triplet. If they weigh less, then that's fewer pounds that you're potentially getting paid for. So we need to keep that in mind. While we can adjust those animals up, when they go to the sale, they're going to weigh what they weigh. And there's no adjusting that once they get there. We also have ram or buck test evaluations, and some of you may be familiar with these. The whole idea here is you take a group of animals, you take them to a central location, you put them on feed, and you control the environment. So you keep everyone in the same setting, the same feed, you house everybody together, and you can control some of those environmental factors that way. It's an excellent opportunity to measure difficult to measure traits. And so traits like parasite resistance, traits like feed efficiency, those traits that it may be hard for you to measure on your farm, we can take to this, a central location. Oftentimes these are run by universities, and we can test those animals and we can provide some of those data for you. But again, this is a phenotypic form of selection. Again, we haven't isolated genetics from environment to this point. It's still phenotype. I say it divides contemporary groups. We're going to talk about contemporary groups in just a couple slides. But you may only take 3 to 5 animals to a performance test. And so you may have 50 animals at home. And instead of being able to compare between all 50 animals, you've only taken 3 to the buck test. And so now you can only compare between those 3 animals. And so you're actually, in a lot of cases, it's more powerful to keep those animals at home and be able to compare within that larger group. So we need to be mindful of that. And pre-test management may influence test performance. How much they're fed beforehand, how they're managed beforehand could influence how they perform on test, even though we're providing that equal opportunity for them while they are on test. And our last factor here, estimated breeding values. And I end on this one because this is our most accurate selection tool. And why EBVs, why estimated breeding values are so much more powerful is they remove the environmental component. So we say phenotype is a combination of genotype plus environment. These breeding values take out the entire environmental component. They're looking just at the genotype alone. And so it really simplifies ram or buck selection because we can select on just genetics instead of phenotype that could be influenced by, environmental factors we may or may not be able to control. And it's relevant between herds. So the estimated breeding values in my flock, if we were raising the same breed of sheep, those breeding values would be relevant in your flock as well. So this is actually a genetic form of selection. The cons, just the labor and time to collect and submit data may be a bit tedious, but you can certainly buy animals that already have these breeding values that someone else took all the time to do that. And so that can be beneficial. They predict genetic merit. So they're a numerical representation of genotype. And so where we think of sometimes in cattle, we think about coat color. This is a really easy example. Red is recessive to black. We can often use those letters, maybe a capital B to represent the dominant black allele, where maybe we use a lowercase b to represent the recessive red allele. If an animal is homozygous black, a homozygous dominant, capital B, we have the heterozygote, that's a capital B, lowercase b, that carries the recessive allele, but it's kind of masked by the dominant allele. Or we can have, that homozygous recessive individual with 2 little b's that has a red coat. And so on really simple traits like that, we can use letters to signify what the genotype is. But with much more complex traits like weaning weights, like parasite resistance, it becomes a lot more complicated. And so we actually have statistical methods where we can determine what that genotype is and use numbers to represent that genotype. And so that's where these estimated breeding values really come from. And because of that, because we're looking at genotype independent of environment, they're more accurate than our performance data. They're more accurate than adjusted performance records. They're more accurate than ram or buck tests. So they're really the best tool we have in the toolbox. They are estimated breeding values, not true breeding values. So we need to be cognizant of that. And there's generally an associated accuracy value. The higher the accuracy value, the more accurate that breeding value is. And so we go back to this equation, and to be able to isolate out what's genotype versus what's environment, we have to control the environment. If environment stays constant, if environment doesn't change, then the changes in phenotype we would predict to be an impact or caused by a change in genotype. If the phenotype goes up, if weaning weights go up and environment is constant, well, those animals probably weigh more because their genetics are better, because the environment, they had an equal opportunity to perform. And so contemporary groups are a group of animals that share the same environment. We have given that group of animals an equal opportunity to express their genetic potential. If we do that, the animals, the differences that we observe between those animals within a contemporary group, we would predict those differences to be genetic. So we need to think about, we need nutrition. Nutrition is a big one. We got to provide all the animals with the same nutrition so they have the same opportunity. Same environmental conditions. We don't want to house one group on pasture and one group in a barn. Obviously, the group in the barn is probably going to weigh more and have higher health status than the group that's out on pasture full of parasites. And so we need to provide them with the same consistent environment. And then, the sex of the animal, the type of birth, type of rearing, age of the dam and the lamb. Fortunately, as I've already mentioned a couple slides ago, we can adjust for all these factors. And so we can take those into account and put them all on the same playing field so we can compare them. And then where these breeding values really differ from our other performance metrics is they bring in this concept of heritability. And heritability simply means what proportion of what we observe, the phenotype, can be explained by genetics. So it's the genetic component of a given trait. These range from 0 to 1. So a trait with a 0 heritability has no genetic component. There's no genetic impact on that trait whatsoever. It would be like, if someone dyed their hair, the genetics didn't determine what color their hair was dyed. That was all environmental. You dyed your hair a certain color. Where, a heritability of 1 would be a 100% genetic control. So like the presence of a head, most animals are born with a head. The presence of a head would be under 100% genetic control. Realistically, most of our traits fall in between those and actually towards the lower end of that range. On average, we'd say, about 20% of what we observe in an animal is controlled by genetics. The rest would be environment. And so this is just a range of some of the heritabilities for various traits in goats. Generally, our maternal traits, like prolificacy, are low heritable traits, 10 to 15%. Our weight traits, generally moderately heritable, in that 20% range. And then our carcass traits generally be our highly heritable traits in the 30 or 40% range on those carcass traits. And I didn't list it here. Parasite resistance in sheep is a moderately heritable trait, ranging 20 to 25% or so. So just a quick summary of all that. These estimated breeding values predict genetic merit for a given trait. And so, we start off with individual performance, and individual performance is what we should be measuring anyway. It's what we measure in the raw performance data. It's what we use to adjust those records. We're going to measure that. But where breeding values differ, we don't just stop at that point. In all of our other tools that I talked about, we stop at the individual. But where breeding values really differentiate themselves is that we don't stop at the individual. We add in, relative performance. How well did mom and dad do? Did the individual perform better or worse than we would predict based on mom and dad? We add in sibling performance, both full sibling and half sibling performance. Did the siblings perform really well compared to the individual, or maybe the siblings performed worse? Progeny performance. Once that animal actually gets mature and enters production, we can adjust, based on, did the progeny live up to expectations? And then we add in genetic correlations. We know that animals that are born heavier are probably going to be heavier at weaning. Animals that are heavier at weaning, probably going to be heavier at a post-weaning time point. And so we can adjust and we can tweak these numbers based on the genetic correlations between different traits that we know are related, that we know share genes. But we know that the genes that control weaning weight, maybe it's probably some of the same genes that control how heavy they are after weaning. And so we know those, we have metrics for that, and so we can adjust for that as well. So we take all of those factors into account, and the computer program spits out one of these estimated breeding values, and they are our most accurate selection tool because we have so much information. The more we know about something, the better we can predict it. And so we know so much more, there's so much more data that goes into one breeding value, we can predict that genetic component much more accurately. So we have lots of traits with EBVs. These are just a sampling. We have, maternal traits, prolificacy traits. We have growth traits, our carcass traits, muscle, as well as fat. And then we have some fitness traits, like fecal egg count. We actually have a genetic metric for fecal egg count, which is a measure of parasite resistance at both the weaning and post-weaning time points. So in summary here, I know I went through that fairly quickly, but happy to answer any questions at the end here. We need to start off by determining what our selection goals are. If you don't have a goal, you have no idea where to go. So we need to start off with those goals. We need to assess our current level of production. So where do we sit today? And that comes back to those records. Where do we sit today? What's our goals? And then based on where we are today and what our goals are, we can determine what the selection priorities are. You know, we don't need to select for everything all at once. And actually, the more things you select for at a given time, the less progress you make in any given one of those traits. So you're better off picking, you know, prioritizing 2 or 3 traits, making progress in those traits before you just try to select for everything. And so by determining those goals, by assessing current production, you're able to, you know, establish those priorities and determine what 2 or 3 traits are most important that you try to, you know, make progress in. And then we need to use the appropriate tools. And here, you know, estimated breeding values are our most accurate selection tool. They represent, you know, an actual genotype, the actual genetics of that individual, independent of what that environment is. And we need to remember that, you know, the pounds of whether it be lambs or kids weaned per female is really a driver in profitability. The more that female can produce as a litter, we're not talking about just individual weights, as a litter, the more that she can produce, the better off we're going to be. And then we just need to pay attention to input costs as well. We all know that you know, things aren't cheap these days. And so we need to be cognizant of those animals that are more efficient. We need to, you know, observe and identify those animals that can do more with less, and find those individuals, select for those genetic lines, and try to make some improvements where we don't have to maybe invest as much, or we can have more animals on the same given land space. Whatever your measure of efficiency is, we need to be cognizant of that, especially during these times. And then I'll leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Jay Lush. The genes cannot develop the characteristic unless they have the proper environment, and no amount of attention to the environment will cause the characteristic to develop unless the necessary genes are present. And really, I think this does a great job of summarizing how we got to have good genetics, but we also we need to provide those genetics with the right environment to perform in. We can have the best genetics in the world, and if our nutrition program is terrible, then those genetics will never live up to their potential. At the same time, we can have the best management system in the world. We can have the best housing. We can have the best nutrition. We can have the best, health management program. We can be doing all of those things right. But if we don't make genetic progress, if we don't identify and select for those elite genetics, we're never going to see progress. We're never going to see advancement, because those genes we have a great environment, but that animal can only perform so well based on what genes that they have. And so we need to be mindful of that. It really takes both. It takes genetics as well as environment, a proper environment to really maximize how those animals are performing and get the most out of them. So with that, hopefully I didn't get too long-winded there, but I'll unshare here. And maybe it might be best to follow up with questions at the very end, and we can let Andy share his slides here, and he'll go into more detail on record keeping specifically.
Well, good evening, everyone. The talk what I'm going to share with you tonight follows very nicely with what Dr. Weaver has kind of laid out in making selection, because to make good selections and to create those breeding values, you have to keep some records on the performance of those animals to both calculate those numbers and if you aren't doing breeding values, just making good decisions on animals to either cull or to keep, or when to market or when to vaccinate and those sort of things. Good record keeping can be very essential. My name is Andy Burlingham. I do work with Pitt County Cooperative Extension Service as a livestock agent, as well as I run Tar River Ranch, where we run about 40 head of ewes and 20 head of does. So some of the things I'm going to share a bit with the record keeping here, kind of some of my personal experiences with record keeping and what works best for me, and kind of some of those things that some pitfalls sometimes you can fall into when record keeping. So, why should we keep records? Number one, it helps us make good decisions. And the decisions we are trying to make, of course, in culling, right? We want to remove those animals that are not performing or not reaching the economic value that we need for the input costs, right? Those ones that are maybe weaning small kids, or ones that are always maintaining poor body condition, not rebreeding on time. Those ones that are just low performing for whatever our production method is. We want to be able to remove those, and to know if they're performing up to standard. If they are above average, average, or below average for our performance, we need to keep some records on that. Record keeping is also very important for making those replacement selections, whether that's keeping replacement females to bring back into the herd, or selecting, the next breeding male, the ram or buck for the herd. Keeping those records. What was their, what did their parents' performance has been doing, what, maybe looking back even farther, grandparents or their siblings. So those kind of things, and what's their personal performance, whether that be in growth, or if we're talking some sort of other production, maybe wool, if you're producing for wool, looking at micron diameter or pounds of wool produced, or that sort of thing. Whatever traits you're really wanting to focus on, by having collected data from not only that animal's performance, but also, as we talked about in the previous presentation, their siblings and their parents and maybe grandparents as well can also come into that replacement selection. Definitely record keeping can help make financial decisions. As we talked about, things can be very expensive, and making those decisions, do I need to be feeding? Is my lambs are not growing at a rate, or not reaching that market weight for when I want to be selling them. I can look at what the rate of gain is, and maybe my feeding program is not, reaching their needs. And I can tell that by looking at their weight gains, or maybe I'm not getting as many twins as I would like because I'm not flushing those ewes at a high enough level, or as does at a high enough level to get that extra reproductive proficiency. So making some financial decisions from the records can also be made. And then, of course, management decisions as well. Keeping records of when we've dewormed, when we vaccinated, and those sort of things. When do we last trim feet? Those sort of things. Keeping a record of that can help us make sure we do those things on a timely manner, making sure we're getting booster shots done in a timely manner. Maybe we're keeping a record of FAMACHA scores, or tracking those animals that are more parasite prone, those sort of things. Or when was the last time this ewe or doe lambed, so we know when we should be moving her in to get her rebred, and that sort of thing. So management decisions also can come off that records. The most important thing I can tell you about records is you want to track the economically important traits to your operation. And there are tons of different things that we can track, and you don't need to track them all. Sometimes we can get kind of overwhelmed trying to track every little data point, and maybe not all those data points are important to our operation. So we really want to track those traits that have the economic impact for our operation. That's going to depend on what your focus is. Am I selling weanling lambs? Am I a dairy goat herd? Am I focusing on wool quality? Whatever the economic important trait is, that's the data that we want to collect. Some basics that usually are going to manage, across most herds and flocks. Of course, reproduction, right? How often are they lambing? How often are they kidding? Are they having singles, twins, or triplets? Are they doing either rebreeding in a and turning around and rebreeding in a proper fashion, in a shorter the duration of rebreeding? Those sort of traits are always important, because most of our operations are driven by the reproductive rate of those females. If you're selling market animals, of course, growth is very important. Feed is expensive, and how efficiently those animals are converting that feed that you're feeding into pounds of animal that you can sell or market is one of the most important things. So, you know, collecting weights, whether that be at birth and weaning and maybe yearling weights, or a rate of gain during periods of feeding periods, those sort of things, that is growth traits, are usually can be very important numbers to collect. Genetics. This is probably one that should always, across most farms, you know, keeping a track of what sire is those lambs or those kids come out of. Then we can make decisions. Is this a buck or is this a ram that we really want to use on this operation? Do we want to keep offspring off this buck? Because if, you know, his kids are really fast growing or his kids are very prolific, those are kind of the daughters that we want to be keeping, and those genetics we want to be proliferating. And then especially if we're raising our own replacement females or replacement breeding males, knowing what lineage, what genetics they come from is very important. So we do not get into either if we're, you know, an inbreeding or a line breeding situation, those sort of things, we'll be able to track that. And if you have registered animals, of course, those genetics are even come a bigger play, right? We have to know when we go to register as offspring, which one was its mother, which one was the dam, which one was the sire, for doing those registration papers. Also, you know, health, because health has a big impact on all the things we talked about previously. Reproduction and growth are definitely affected by health. So, right, we're going to keep track of, you know, maybe we have those does that always seem to be just kind of have a low FOMACHA score. They're always a bit wormy compared to everybody else, and therefore she's not rebreeding on time, and maybe her kids are weaning off at a slighter weight. She's not producing as much milk, her wool quality is lower, or whatever, you know, because of those things that are happening with her with the parasite issues is impacting her performance on the other traits. Those are maybe ones we're not going to keep back, or maybe those ones we're going to cull sooner or cull this season, right? So tracking those cell things. Same thing with, okay, I gave, you know, those lambs, I gave, you know, the CD&T shot here on the, you know, the 15th of February. I know in 3 weeks I'm coming back and I need to booster everybody, but maybe you only, you know, you booster some depending on the age. We have a longer lambing or kidding season, you booster half of them now, and in 2 or 3 weeks you're boosting or you're vaccinating some more, and then a little bit later some other ones. Keeping a track of which ones have had their booster shot and that sort of thing are also very important things from a health standpoint that we need to keep records on. And I will tell you, to keep good records, every animal needs an ID. This is very key. I don't know how many operations I go to and I ask them if they're keeping records. They're like, well, not really. Or I ask them, you know, can you tell me about these, you know, I'm having some performance issues in my animals. I go and say, okay, so these thinner lambs or these ones that are growing slower, do you know which ewes they're coming out of? And they're like, well, I don't really know because they don't have ear tags in my ewes. And I don't have ear tags in my lambs. And if you don't have an ID in the animal, you can't track the records. There may be some people that have just a couple animals and maybe you personally know them by a name and you can do that. But once the time you get over, you know, about 10 animals, you really need to be putting some ID in those animals to be able to efficiently tracking them. Most of the time that's going to be ear tag. It could also be a tattoo, an ear notch or some other form, but really ear tags are the easiest to read, especially when you're working that animal, and really the easiest to track. You can put a lot of information on an ear tag, right? You can have an individual number. You can put a sire's name on there. You can put a dam's number on there. There's different kinds of things you can put on the ear tag that both give you a visual idea or information when you're looking at it and allows for easier record keeping. So it's very essential that every animal needs to have an ID so that you can record the data efficiently. When you don't have IDs, it makes keeping records very difficult, if not impossible. There are many different ways that you can keep records. Of course, the most basic and where most people start is with a paper record. And for many years, I kept a paper record. When I had fewer animals, I just wrote it down in a little notepad. You know, my lambing dates or my kidding dates of, you know, which one had what was the use number, if it was a twin, was it a single, what was the sex, the day it was born, and the tag number of that offspring, right? And then when I weaned that offspring, I would write down, okay, here's what the weaning weight was. It made it a little bit more cumbersome to work at if you're trying to collate that data a little bit, if you have very many head, but it's a good basic way to get that data down where you can go back and review it. You can do that with a simple, just a little notebook and a pen that you can keep right there in the barn with you, where you can write it down when one is born. Very simple to do. There's some more commercial ones you can buy that are already printed out online that kind of have the same thing. If you like a little bit more of a fancy look, or, you know, a little bit more of an even look, you can do that as well. But paper records are kind of a starting point for keeping records. And of course, nowadays with a cell phone, you can also just keep it as type it into your cell phone in the notes or whatever as you go through that as well. Because, you know, that most people have that cell phone on their hip or in their pocket, or they can pull out and record that as well. Once you start moving into having more head, or really wanting to analyze the data, you really can move it into kind of more of a digital format of a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet can either be done, you know, make it yourself, which is what I do. It's kind of just an Excel spreadsheet where I keep a track of those things by ear tag number. That, you know, keeps all that information. You can see this is a copy of one of my spreadsheets here. This is from last year for lambs and kids that were born last year. We got a lot of different things on this sheet here. You know, their farm ID tag, what sex they were. We have some different names because some of them are registered names, and we got farm names, and then some 4-H kids show some that get names that way. We just got that in there. Their scrapie tag. Of course, every animal, sheep and goat, needs to have that scrapie tag. So we put that scrapie number. Some of them are getting shown, so they get a got to be NC tag. Their birth dates, were they registered, were they not registered? Is it my goats, if they were, what percentage for Boer goats, what percentage purebred they are, if they were sold, how much we sold them for, when they were sold, if they died, if they're actively and been kept back, all these sort of things we're keeping records on. And the nice thing is, and doesn't show on this one, but every one of these ear tags has a backlog to it that goes back to the doe or the ewe that lambed them. And I can pull up this individual, you know, so this sheet, if they come back into the flock, they get an individual record, then tracks them for the lifetime that they are in the flock. So I can pull up their number and I can see their lambing record or their kidding record for their lifetime since they've been in the flock. So I can see back 3, 4, 5 years of records of how frequently they kidded, were they having twins, were they having singles, what was the birth weight, what was the weaning weights of those offspring that was coming from. So I can kind of track that data over a longer period of time and start to make those big decisions on selection pressure that I want to put. You know, I want them heavier weaning weights. I want ones that maybe I'm having some kidding issues. I need to bring down my birth weights a little bit. I don't want to save a buck kid off of this sire because he tends to throw heavier birth weights, or I don't want to use this ram on your first time ewe lambs because he throws more difficult bursts and that sort of thing. So I can track that over time and make those better management decisions through the spreadsheet. So with a spreadsheet, you can use, make one yourself, pretty simply in Excel, or there is some commercial software out there. It's kind of pricey, a lot of them. Some are a little bit cheaper. A lot of them are set up where they can be multifunction, so you can pull it up on your phone and your tablet and your laptop and share between all three. Many of them are set up so if you're using electronic ID tags, they automatically handle that. So when you scan that ID tag as they're going through the chute or a scale or whatever, it automatically pulls that into the computer and populates that sheet with whatever data you're collecting that day. So there are some of the softwares that can work. And generally, I'm going to say the commercial software, if you don't have a fairly large flock, probably not the most economically feasible, because some of them are pretty expensive for what they do. And you can do that most of the time, unless you have a lot of complicated data, or if you are using an EID tag where you need that system to read it and kind of populate those things automatically, the commercial software may not make sense financially, but there's several of those out there that you can look at. So in summary, the key points for collecting records is you got to have an ID in every animal. When you don't have an individual ID and tag, you simply can't track that animal efficiently, especially as you get more and more head. I said, if you got like 10 head or less, maybe you know each animal individually, but as you start to move through time, your memory, trust me, your memory starts to go, and you remember 5 years ago, which one was that had this one, if you have a name down there or whatever. So it makes it harder over time. In the moment, it's pretty easy. Yeah, I know this one. I can say this one had this, had twin kids or whatever. But as you move into time, that starts to get a little bit more less impractical. So really having that ID number with an individual ear tag or tattoo is really key for being able to track data and move data and manage data over time. The most important thing I say is then collect the important data to your operation. And that's going to vary in what things are important to your financial success of your operation. Whether you're selling breeding stock, register stock, weanling kids, if wool's important thing, collecting data on pounds sheared every year, what the micron diameter is, color quantity, or whatever it may be. The important data points is what you should collect. If that thing is not important or is not being used as selection criteria, you probably don't need to be collecting it. If you like working with data, and some people do, and you want to collect lots of other kinds of data, you can do that. But if it's really not affecting your bottom line by making a better selection process or making better management decisions, it probably doesn't need to be kept. Find a system that works best for you. And this once again goes back, it's very much on an individual basis of what works best for you. And, if you only have 10 or 15 head, maybe a sheet of paper, a notebook is what's going to work best for you. If you have a larger operation, or if you really like to sort and kind of analyze the data, putting it into a spreadsheet that you're going to work with on the computer is probably going to be the best thing for you. And then once you collect that data, make sure you make it work for you. There's nothing worse. People collect a lot of data, but they don't really do anything with it and don't use it for making better decisions. The question is, why are you collecting the data? So if you are collecting data, make sure you use that data to make your operation better, that you make smarter and better decisions as you move through there. So that's really key, is if you're collecting data, make sure that you use it. And that's what I got with you this evening. Is there any questions? I guess we're going back to some group questions there. That's what I got for you tonight on using data collection and keeping some records.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, we got a couple questions in the chat, and I think the two that we'll start out with come up during Dr. Weaver's presentation. So first one, Dr. Weaver, is sorry if you already said this already. On average, how long do you wean for?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is like what age you wean at. So generally, absolutely no earlier than 45 days. That would be kind of the threshold for success. But realistically, 60 days would be much more ideal. That's in a little bit more intensive type system where maybe, you're crate feeding and, helping those animals along. I would say, if you're more pasture based, if there's less feed supplementation, waiting until they're 90 or 120 days is not the end of the world. Generally the cost of a, lactation ration, becomes a little bit hindering if we're feeding a lot, we're supplementing a lot. So we don't want to go too far past 60 days if we're feeding those animals really hard. But if you've got abundant grass and the grass is decent quality, you can keep them out there for a little bit longer than that. By 120 days of age, probably good to be thinking about getting everything weaned, just because a lot of times the females will wean the lambs or kids on their own once you get pretty close to that age. And so lactation and milk production is going to be pretty low by that point. In terms of like the actual weaning process, you want those animals to be dried off pretty quick. So we need to think about weaning management. And I think we talked about that in previous webinar. And so you can refer back to that one as well. If you're curious about the actual methods to weaning. And then I see the second question there. Your question about prolificacy and crossbreeding is an excellent question, and one that I'm glad you brought up, because I didn't have time to put it in slides. But that's an excellent point, in that we can make substantial progress through crossbreeding, especially for traits that have low heritability. So, traits like our maternal traits, like prolificacy, very lowly heritable, but our most lowly heritable traits respond the most favorably to heterosis or crossbreeding. So a trait like prolificacy, we can make a decent amount of progress with just by utilizing crossbreeding. And so, your example, find those prolific breeds, Romanovs, Finn sheep. If you're raising wool type sheep, those are prolific breeds that you could crossbreed to and bring in some of those prolificacy traits. If you're maybe working with hair sheep, you can find some lines of Katahdin sheep that are quite prolific, and you breed to those more prolific lines, and you can add in some prolificacy. Or maybe you have some Dorpers. Well, you could crossbreed the Dorpers on some Katahdins to improve prolificacy in those females and productivity of those females. And so that's a great point there. Certainly crossbreeding is something worth looking into, and didn't have a lot of time to dive into it too deep tonight, but happy to answer any other questions on that as well. What metric do we use to determine parasite resistance? So we're using fecal light count. Fecal light count would be the best measure of true parasite resistance. The ones that are shedding fewer parasite eggs, we're able to those are the individuals that are able to prevent or minimize the establishment of those parasites, the production of eggs from those parasites. And so that would be the best metric for parasite resistance. So the lower, that would be a trait where lower numbers are better. The lower the fecal egg count, the more parasite resistant they are. Any other questions?
And while we wait on some more questions, I am finishing up the getting the post poll set up. So once I get that done here in a second, I will share that.
I see Lee and Neil posted their emails in the chat there. So if you all have any questions related to marketing, they're a great resource to have around, and encourage you to reach out to them if you've got some specific questions there. Andy, you want to tackle Colleen's question there on the ear tags?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, normally you could start with one. So there's a lot of different ways you can approach ear tags. I will say on my farm, I actually do ear tags by sire. So I have a different color ear tag, and actually has the sire name on one side, and starts at 1 and goes up until I quit using that sire as birth tags. That way it helps me track those genetic lineages. I can see the performance very easily looking. I say, okay, those lambs are looking really good. Oh, I can see they're all coming from the same ram. Or, oh, those aren't really growing well, and they all are coming from the same, coming out of the same one. Then I can say, oh, maybe that's, make some decisions there. So as far as registering, yeah. So for scrapie tags, that's a federal number that you apply for through USDA APHIS. And for a scrapie tag, every scrapie tag is going to have a special unique number that's going to be assigned to your farm at the top. And those tags will once again start at 1 and can only go up. So every time you order tags, you're going to start at the last number you had as the individual number for the scrapie tags, and they'll continue to go up. As far as using your own farm ID tag, you can start at whatever number you want. You can buy kind of generic tags that just come in one color, choose a color, starting at 1, or if you want to start at 50, you can order 50. There's many of them that do custom printed tags. That's what I do at my farm, is the custom printed tag, so I can have a little bit extra information on there that I use for helping track some of my stuff. So there's many different ways you can do with ear tags. The key is to make sure you choose an ear tag that fits the size animal you're using. I like the little smaller lamb tags for my younger animals. As we move up into the older ewes, they get a little bit bigger tag. The scrapie tags typically are a little bit bigger tag, kind of what we call the small size or small ruminant size tag there. But yes, ear tagging is very key for being able to make some management decisions so you can track those animals.
And the questions that came in about fecal egg count. So what I'll say, so if you're doing fecal egg counts to try to diagnose a parasite infection, it needs to be done by a vet. If your goal is to determine, this is X parasite is infecting my sheep or goats, that diagnosis would need to be done by a vet. If you're trying to quantify how many parasite eggs are there for genetic selection, it does not need to be done by a vet. And so, how do you do it by yourself? It's not a hard process, but it does take a little bit of experience. And I would say contact your local extension agent, your county extension agent, and they can get you connected. And we've been doing a number of fecal egg count trainings over the last couple of years, and we'll continue to do that, in county-based or regional-based workshops. And so I encourage you to keep your eye out for flyers and opportunities to maybe attend one of those workshops where we can help get you trained to be able to do some of those fecal egg counts. But certainly in the meantime, your livestock agent there in your county could get you started, or at least point you in the right direction to get you started there. I did put in a link there. The American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control there's 3 labs. Texas A&M, Virginia Tech, and West Virginia University offer, relatively low cost fecal egg counts for those larger producers or smaller producers even that want to get fecal egg counts run. And so, compared to what a vet would charge you, that $5 or $6 is probably a half to a third, maybe of what a vet would charge you. And they'll quantify the egg count, and you can use that for genetic selection purposes. And so I think that's a really great resource that we have relatively close here in North Carolina. So hopefully that's helpful. If not, reach out to me and we can be in touch, and I'm happy to help there and see what we can do to get some fecals and some of that data for you to utilize.
While we finish up, if anybody's got any more questions, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll get to them before we get off. Again, if you've been on the other webinars, this one is being recorded. Once we get the recording finished, I'll send it back out through the Eventbrite. It'll be a YouTube link, so it'll take you to the YouTube page where you can see the previous webinars that we've done. And next month, we will finish up this webinar series on March 16th, same time, 7 o'clock. And that night's topic will be reproductive management for improved flock and herd productivity. So we'll look at animal selection and culling, go into some repro health as well as some advanced repro topics. And I think we have one more question that come through the chat.
Yes, that's a good question as well. So AI versus natural matings. That one. So in terms of like reproductive efficiency, we'll talk about that a little bit next month, but just briefly, AI conception rates, 50 to 70%. It kind of depends on what method you're using and how much experience the technician has, and a little bit of luck being on your side. Somewhere in that neighborhood, probably on conception rates, AI. So certainly you can get a lot more pregnant natural cover. But there's certainly a lot of opportunity for genetic improvement by using AI and buying in genetics that are more elite than what you have on your farm. So, I would, if you're looking to make genetic progress and have the ability to use some of those, to use AI, those reproductive technologies, that certainly could be beneficial. If you're thinking about just, how do I get the most animals pregnant? Natural service would be the most efficient in getting animals pregnant. So kind of keep that in mind. Maybe AI some, and then clean up with a decent herd sire would be beneficial. So which ear tag I think is being asked there, or which ear to put the ear tag in. Either one works, and there's different methodologies. Some people put the ear tag in the same ear on every single animal. Some people will, based on the sexes of the animal, put an ear tag in one ear. So some people say, ram R goes in the right ear, RR. So rams get their ear tags in the right ear, ewes get their ear tags in the left ear. Some people say, well, females are always right. And so they put the female, the ewes or the does, they put their tags in the right ear. The males get it in the left ear. So really it's up to you and whatever works for your farm and your operation, whatever way you can remember it or what's most consistent for you, I'd say, stick with that method. If you sell an animal at market, is the price determined by breed, hair versus wool sheep? I would say that the price is not solely based on breed. It's based on how heavy the animal is, the composition, the visual appeal, the shapeliness of those animals. And so some buyers prefer hair, some buyers prefer wool, but I would say a lot of that price is determined on the quality of that animal. So oftentimes wool sheep bring a little bit higher prices because they're generally a little bit heavier muscle, and they're going to have some more shapeliness to them, and so they're going to bring a little bit more compared to the hair sheep. Other times hair sheep bring pretty good money at some sales, especially in North Carolina, and from a environmental productivity efficiency standpoint, oftentimes those hair sheep fit a little bit better with what we're trying to do. So it really depends, and I would say it's more so on the individual animal, what they weigh, and their what we call composition, their muscularity. That has a bigger role to play than just breed alone. So is your question there, like scrapie tag in one ear, national registration in the other ear? I guess it just depends what I usually, if I'm putting 2 tags in, I'll put 1 tag in each ear just so that one ear isn't weighed down. I'll try to spread them out and put 1 in each ear. But again, it doesn't necessarily matter which ear, which one goes in. That's kind of up to you, I'd say.
Well, if anybody does have any questions, you can reach out to myself or any of the presenters. And I think Neil and Lee did put their emails back in the chat, so you can scroll up through there real quick and get those. But contact any of us, and we hope to see y'all in a month at our next and last webinar for this series.
Have a good evening.